Hello, everyone. On behalf of my colleagues, welcome to this month's talk from the Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy seminar series, co-sponsored by the Computer Science Department of the Whiting School of Engineering. Each month, we'll have a talk on research topics at the intersection of assurance and autonomy. This talk will be recorded. Today's speaker is Marzyeh Ghassemi. Dr. Ghassemi is an assistant professor at MIT in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, the Institute for Medical Engineering and Science, and a Vector Institute faculty member holding a Canadian Institute for Advanced Research AI Chair and Canada Research Chair. She holds MIT affiliations with the Jameel Clinic and CSAIL. Professor Ghassemi holds a Hermann L.F. von Helmholtz Career Development Professorships and was named a Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Azrieli Global Scholar and one of MIT Tech Review's 35 Innovators Under 35. Previously, she was a visiting researcher with Alphabet's Verily and an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. Prior to her PhD in computer science at MIT, she received a Master of Science degree in biomedical engineering from Oxford University as a Marshall Scholar, and BS degrees in computer science and electrical engineering as a Goldwater Scholar at New Mexico State University. Dr. Ghassemi's talk is Designing Machine Learning Processes for Equitable Health Systems. We're all very interested in the topic and excited to have you join us. Thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and share screen. All right. Thank you for inviting me today. My name is Marzyeh Ghassemi, and I'm going to talk to you today about designing machine learning processes for equitable health systems. The first thing I'd like you to have in mind as we hear about some of this research today is that I believe that embodied data, so data from human bodies, is actually a powerful force for good. My group actually works to design robust, private, and fair algorithms, and that requires diverse data sets for research use. So a lot of you'll hear about, will get you thinking about data and what data means in the context of machine learning, but then also in the context of a socio-technical system. Because for having something like AI or a machine learning system improve science and address medical harm or not perpetuate medical harm, we really need good data. And it's, not just one kind of data from one kind of person. We really need a diverse kind of data here. And we also would really like that to come from a representative sample of the population it's meant to address. My work is mostly today going to focus on medical records, but obviously all of these other kinds of data are very important for a more global sense of who is healthy and what being healthy means. My group focuses on creating actionable insights in human health. And there's three things we try to focus on. The first is really algorithmic improvement. So this is designing models that I say are healthy. So that means robust, private, and fair. So this is trying to create models that are technically better. And so they maybe don't suffer from some of the same performance gaps that you would see in other spaces, or they work particularly well for the heterogeneous, sparse, biased data that we get in healthcare data sets. The second thing that we think about is what kind of healthcare is healthy. And by that, I mean, maybe you don't need to design a new machine learning system all the time. Sometimes it makes sense to take state-of-the-art machine learning systems and use them to audit the care that's happening in a medical setting. And finally, we also look at, if you train a model, somebody's going to use it. And that person will be a human, probably. And so how do people behave when they're given these pieces of advice or recommendations from machine learning systems? So I'll focus in this talk mostly on research we've done in this middle category, auditing healthcare systems. You'll hear a little bit about some of the algorithmic work that we do, and also a little bit about how we think this might impact human behaviors. The first thing to know in the algorithmic design space is that it's not just my group that does this. This is a huge community of people now. There are whole separate academic conferences that are focused on machine learning for health. And most of the mainstream machine learning conferences or health and science journals have a machine learning for health track. And so these are just a sample of papers that were posted in a table from Eric Topol's review a few years ago now. And you can see that machine learning models really here are spanning the range of the human lifespan for the kinds of tasks that they're addressing. And at this point in my lecture in class, I almost always ask the students, okay, hypothetical situation, you walk into the hospital, they say, actually, we have a COVID surge, so the emergency room is really busy. Nobody can triage you right now. But you can either wait 3 hours for an emergency room doc to see you, or we could have our sepsis model triage you right now. And our sepsis model has been benchmarked in this paper right here. It has a certain performance accuracy, which is as good as the clinicians that were benchmarked in that same paper. Would you choose that? So you can have the AI system with an actual paper that has a reported performance at or above the humans it was benchmarked against right now. Or you could have a human triage you in 3 hours. What do you do? Most people actually say that they would be happy to get the immediate triage. But there's invariably a small group of people that say, I don't think so. And I always ask that group why. And usually they point to two things. And the first is the sample size N varies quite a bit in these studies. It varies from a couple hundred people to hundreds of thousands of people. And so the question is, just how robust is this? And you could ask the question, well, the doctor that's going to see me, what is his or her N? What sample size are they dealing with? But this is something that when it's in a paper and you can actually look at it, people can feel different ways about. And the second thing people notice is the performance metric that's being reported here, the AUC. It's one number. It's not broken down by subtype. And what I mean by that is it's possible that in a sample of 273 people for this study of Alzheimer's disease, there were very few women or very few minorities. And so maybe this performance doesn't reflect how well this model would perform on me. And the thing that I want to emphasize here is that it's not like we think, or it's not like I think, or most people in my field think that AI is biased and wants to perform more poorly on certain people. It's that humans are biased. Doctors are humans and humans are biased. So guess what? Doctors are biased. And so if a machine learning model is learning from human practice, it might learn things you don't like because it's taking often an entire EHR system, an entire hospital record system that includes times when different doctors are tired or make mistakes, or some doctors just don't like certain people. They have implicit biases. And when we learn on that kind of data, there was a very cute TV show about this doctor. And somebody once told me, the reason this picture is here, is somebody once told me like, oh, so you're trying to train machine learning models like Dr. House, like severely analytical. And I was like, that man was a drug addict. Did we watch the same show? He mistreated his patients, like he isolated his staff. No, I don't want to train machine learning models that behave like this fictional character. Because if AI behaved that way, we would very quickly not want it to practice. So let me walk you through an example of how practice and data could create undesirable machine learning consequences. So this is a recent paper that we put out in Nature Medicine. And this is a very popular machine learning task. Okay, lots of people do it. If you've heard anything about machine learning in health, you've probably heard about chest x-rays and deep neural networks working on chest x-rays. So we took the three large public chest x-ray data sets, that's over 700,000 chest x-ray images, okay, so good sample size. And we trained a DenseNet, which is a kind of convolutional neural network to predict no finding, which means the model says the patient is healthy. So in our triage example, you come in, there's a chest x-ray, and the model looks at your chest x-ray. It's been trained on 700,000 other chest x-rays, and it decides whether you're healthy, there's no finding, and you can just go home. There's no problem with you. And then we're going to look at the false positive rate for this label, for being healthy, for no finding. We're going to call the false positive rate the underdiagnosis rate. Why are we going to call it that? Because you can imagine if one subgroup has a false positive prediction of no finding or healthy, when actually they're sick, if we deploy that model and it has this higher rate of a false positive in like female patients, for example, that would lead to a higher rate of no treatment for patients who actually needed treatment. Okay. So we train this model. You can look at the paper. We get state-of-the-art results for predicting all the standard things that you might want to predict in aggregate, just like in that table I showed you. And then we find that if you look at that aggregated performance by subgroup, these models have the largest underdiagnosis rate on female patients, young patients, Black patients, and patients on Medicaid insurance. And the performance is actually substantially worse for intersectional groups. And this means that Black or Hispanic female patients are underdiagnosed more than white female patients are. And so if you just looked at the underdiagnosis rate in female patients, you would say, oh, it's not great that it's higher, but then you can look at what happens for double minority patients here, and it's even worse. And you might say, I'm really happy, as one reviewer for this paper did, I'm very happy you did that study, but I don't see its importance because really all you've shown us is that we should audit our models. Okay, fine, that's a reasonable point. That means that, every paper that you see now, if there's a new paper, review paper that Eric Topol comes out with, I hope he does, there should be a breakdown by certain subgroups so I can see how well your model does. That should become maybe a standard. And so this is actually the very first paper that I wrote where we looked at these kind of breakdowns and tried to say, hey, there are differences that we're seeing in the ways that models perform by a patient's reported gender, insurance, and ethnicity. But let's go through another example. So you've probably heard about large language models. If you haven't been reading the news for the past few years. So large language models, these contextual language models, are very popular in industry. Most big tech companies use them for things like email completion, next sentence prediction, ad targeting. For a while, the National Health Service in the United Kingdom had a chatbot, a health chatbot that recommended clinical question answering based on these large language models. And what they do is they take large amounts of human language and they train very complex, large neural models. And then these models are able to complete things like sentence prediction or story generation in a Turing test beatable way. That means that when you ask humans, did a machine make this or did a human make this? They can't tell. It's good enough that it's difficult to disambiguate the source. So we took one of these models that was trained on PubMed. So it's not Reddit or 4chan, it's scientific articles and their abstracts. And then we took real medical notes from a Boston area hospital. So here's a real one. It was the patient's race, so white, Caucasian, Black, African-American patient became belligerent and violent, sent to, and then we asked the model, we're gonna fill in the blank here, and then we asked the model to fill in the rest of this story, like it does in practice for hundreds of startups that use them for chatbots or sentence completion or email completion or medical record infilling. And so if I say to Cybert, which is publicly available, you can go test this now, you can download it, it's publicly available. So if I say to Cybert that a Caucasian or a white patient became belligerent and violent, The model completes the sentence with sent to hospital, period. If I say that an African, African-American, or Black patient became belligerent and violent, the model completes it with sent to prison. And again, this model has been trained on scientific articles. And so you can imagine that the large language models that companies train that are not just trained on scientific articles, they have substantially worse completions. And one thing that people often tell me, I went through a phase last year of rage papers where every time somebody said, you can fix this problem with technical solution A, I got enraged and had one of my graduate students spend a year writing a paper proving that these people who made these very myopic suggestions were wrong. This is one of those papers. Can you just fix this with explanations? Complex models can be hard to understand. Many articles have been written on the fact that simple human interpretable post hoc explanation methods are a good candidate proposal to help users trust model predictions. And so I had a student look at the approximation quality of these explanation models. Why am I calling it approximation quality? Because all post hoc explanations on a black box model, a big neural network, are approximations. And there's two kinds. There's local explanations where you say, I have an example that lies here. Show me for that very, very specific part of this snaky boundary space what the deciding line between these positive and negative examples is. And then there's also global explanation models where you say, no, no, no. I see this snaky boundary on a global level, and I want you to give me the best linear projection so I can give an explanation to people using that. I want to emphasize how common and how popular explanation methods, post hoc explanation methods are. The Lime paper alone has over 8,000 citations. People really use these models. So Lime and SHOP are popular local explanation models, and sparse decision trees and generalized additive models, or GAMs, are very popular global explanation models. And again, the idea here is we're going to train simple human interpretable models that imitate a black box model's behavior at either a local or global level, because those are easier to interpret. So here's what we're going to check, though. We're going to measure the fairness of those local and global explanation models. I just told you that these big neural network black box models are unfair, right? What happens when we do these explanations? And so here you can see if the boxes, for example, are women and the triangles are men, this snaky decision boundary correctly classifies everybody who has the disease in blue and doesn't have the disease in orange. But if I force a linear projection, one group is going to lose out. And here, and most often in machine learning systems, it's going to be the minority group. Here it's women, because they have fewer examples. And so there's just not as much incentive to have this explanation work well for them. So we're going to compare the difference between average and worst case fidelity. So let's pretend we have a model that on average performs at 95%, but that aggregate is made out of performing at 98% for men and 80% for women. So the first thing is the difference between average and worst case fidelity. And then the second metric we're going to look at is just the absolute difference in fidelity across subgroups. Okay, so two different ways to look at how well we're doing. We're going to look at 4 different data sets, and these are very common data sets that people look at in the fairness community. I am not a fan of all of them. I think some of them have their own issues, but these are for very realistic settings where you might have a machine learning explanation or recommendation system. It's for adults using adult income, trying to predict adult income as a loan approval or qualification guarantor. And we look at it across men and women. So sex is the variable that we're looking at here for fidelity, for fairness. Looking at whether a student passes the bar exam, so predicting how good of a law school student they are and maybe what internships they should be offered ahead of time. And here we look at race as the groups across which we want good fidelity. Looking at ICU, intensive care unit mortality. And here we look at biological sex as the predictor where we want high fidelity. and recidivism risk prediction. And this is an actual thing that people have really done, looking at recidivism risk prediction and then presenting that information to judges when they're trying to look at sentencing and parole. And here again, we're looking across race. And these are all publicly available data sets, which is very important in my line of work, that things are reproducible. So we find that for both local and global models, when you explain the models, you have a significantly worse gap than when you just use the black box neural network. And the gap between the subgroups, the unfairness caused by having these approximations, gets worse the fewer number of features you allow the explanation to have. So the simpler you force your explanation to be, the worse it becomes for your minority subgroups. And you can link this to the amount of information that's present about the minority group in the representation. So if you remove group information from the representation, that reduces the gap. So if I don't tell you who is female or who is Black in my data set, then the gap gets a little bit smaller. But data rebalancing doesn't help this at all. And you can never remove the gap that's caused by the explanation. So this is not something that is, it's actually, bias gaps are made worse by using explanations, and no simple fixes work for addressing this gap that's caused by explanations. Another thing that you might suggest is, okay, you've painted a picture where the data that we have maybe is not very good. And because of these biases, we might learn things that are not appropriate. However, can't we just balance data downstream? So I have the data I have right now. I have data from the VA, for example, only 6% female. But if I learn an acute kidney prediction model that performs really well on VA data, can't I just, the VA won't release its data, but what if I just release the embedding, the model that I learned from that VA data? And then later, for example, during COVID, where acute kidney injury prediction is an important task for men and women, now I have balanced data. And I'll just take this perfectly balanced data and project to this learned VA model. Won't that fix it? And a recent paper that we published this year in ICLR, which is a machine learning, deep learning focused conference, we found no. Actually, the bias that you have in data at the embedding stage, when I learn this, pretend it's a ball, I'm learning how to map data onto this ball somewhere. If I have very few examples of Black faces, mostly examples of white faces, I never learn how to separate out Black faces well. That part of the embedding space just doesn't exist. So when I throw that old bias data away and have perfectly fair balanced data, and now I try to project that onto my, my ball that I learned, there's no space on this ball to correctly represent variation in this beautiful, perfectly balanced data set. And so in our downstream tasks, we found that you actually retain the original bias of the data that you learned on, even though we now have this perfectly balanced data. So it's not something where we can say, let's do the best we can right now and not worry, later we'll have perfect data. This is something we actually have to think about right now. Bias is a strong part of the clinical landscape because it's a strong part of humans. If it's a bias that exists in society, you're going to see it pop up in clinical care. None of these are machine learning papers. These are all epidemiology studies or social studies of health disparities. And so this is a known thing that exists in other spaces. And you might ask, how bad could it be when we add in AI? Do we really need to think about all these social disparities now? They've existed for centuries. Is it really that big of a problem? Pop quiz, everyone. Do you think that this note, it's a real note from a real patient in a real hospital, I promise. Do you think that this note was from a Black or white patient? I redacted the mentions of this patient's race. So there was information about the patient's race in here. It would say, 52-year-old race patient has blah, blah, blah. What do you guys think? Is it obvious? Do you know? Can you tell? I would be surprised if you could, because none of the clinicians we tested could, and we tested quite a few. All my friends were very upset at me for making them take this test. But a machine learning model does know. And some of those things are things that maybe are not so upsetting. So in the United States, at least, there's a higher rate of comorbidities like hypertension in the African-American population. And so maybe there's a higher rate of dialysis. But there's also things in there that you wouldn't like. So we found that it's possible to predict race from a clinical note where you've stripped out all of the racial indicators at a very high rate using both more complex models, but even really simple logistic regression models do pretty well at this. This is across 2 different data sets, both the MIMIC notes, which are a Boston area hospital, and the Columbia notes from New York. And these are reasonable sample sizes of patients that we're dealing with here. And we find some things that are reasonably well known, again, in the medical literature, like references to skin conditions or skin diagnostic criteria of any kind are much more common for white patients. And so if you have darker skin, it's a well-known thing in the dermatology community that there will be fewer mentions of relevant conditions you have. So things like bruising, redness, anything like that. It's just not noted as much in darker skin. We also found that words with negative affect, like difficult, are just mentioned a lot more. The model uses the presence of negative affect words like difficult to predict that you are a Black or African-American patient. We also found really weird things, like if you are a married female Black patient, you are much more likely to have phrases like family or family members used to describe your care plans. It's much more likely if you are a married female white patient to have the word husband used. This is relevant in this data set because often if you are a married female patient, you have a husband who is responsible for the legal care and choices of life support that you might have access to. And so there are really strange personal issues that are noted differently, like the way that family is talked about for African Americans and the way that patient affect is described, like being difficult. Second pop quiz. Is this patient Black or white? This is even harder because you could imagine, I just walked you through, there's negative affect and there's comorbidities, and some of those are explainable and some of them are maybe not desirable, but you could sort of imagine it. What about this? And again, we tested radiologists to ask them, can you tell, is this person Black or white? And it turns out none of them can, but machine learning models can, and they can do it really well across a range of many, many, many different kinds of imaging modalities and data sets. And so I asked all the radiologists who failed this test, what do you think it is? Can you give me a proxy? Like, for the notes, it was using proxies like African Americans tend to have more comorbidities in the United States. And so I'm going to cheat and say, I'm going to guess based on this, right? So I tested a bunch of things, or the students tested a bunch of things. Is it body mass index? No. Is it breast density? No. Is it bone density? No. Is it disease distribution? No. Is it, for example, some part of the frequency domain? No. Even when you high or low pass filter these images, model can still tell pretty well until you get to really high ranges of the frequency spectrum where it looks like a visual noise. The race of the patient, the self-reported race, no genetic ancestry is here, right? There's no genomic information. This is just whether they self-reported Black or white at the hospital. So self-reported race is really obvious to AI in a way that it is not to humans. And again, self-reported race is a very different concept than genetic ancestry. This is just like what I identify as when I go into the hospital, which is obviously a complex, multifactorial, socio-technical thing. And so I think this is really important because we often are using AI and telling it, just copy what the clinicians do, just copy what the clinicians do. But if AI can actually detect things much better than we can, things that are impossible for us to detect. And then it learns that in general, we tend to treat people who self-report as African-American worse, or they're generally provided with worse care. It's going to generalize that in a way that would be hard for us to audit, because we can't even tell from this chest x-ray whether this person is Black or white. The model can. And the final thing I want to talk about is what happens when we deploy models like this, right? Because in the end, a person is going to see a doctor who's going to be making these decisions. So what happens when we take something like that diagnostic AI advice and we give it to people? And so here we have two kinds of doctors that we gave advice to: radiologists who see chest x-rays all day, every day, and non-experts. These are internal and emergency medicine clinicians. They see x-rays, but it's not what they do all the time. And we gave them chest x-rays, real chest x-rays from real patients. And we varied two things. We varied whether we said the advice was from an AI or from a human. And then we varied whether the advice was accurate or inaccurate. So here, whether this final diagnosis that we're recommending was correct or incorrect. In all cases, we knew what the correct diagnosis was because it's a real medical record of somebody who actually existed. And the incorrect advice that we gave was generated by a radiologist, our collaborator, so that it was a plausible incorrect diagnosis. It wasn't like crazy. And then we measured two things. So we're changing these two things up on people, and then we're measuring two things. We're measuring how people are rating the quality of the advice, whether they think it's high or low quality. It's all the same advice. Remember, we're just saying it's from an AI or a human. And then whether they were correct or incorrect in their final diagnostics. The first thing we found is that task experts like radiologists rate AI advice as significantly lower quality than human advice, even though it's the same advice. So here you can see the radiologists that we surveyed. They think that the AI advice is just much worse than the human advice, even though it's all the same. Second, even though, and that was not true, you know, these were not statistically significantly different for the IMEM doctors. Even though these doctors say that the AI advice is lower quality, they have a very similar level of diagnostic accuracy using either. It's slightly higher when we give them AI advice, but not statistically significantly so for both radiologists and IMEM doctors. And you can think of this as, you know, they're just as good under different AI, different beliefs of advice type, but I think about it a different way. They're just as bad. They're failing to dismiss incorrect advice just as often. Here's why. Experts have better diagnostic accuracy in general. So if each one of these lines is actually a doctor, so here's radiologist number 60, and they saw 8 cases. So I'm gonna just put a little blue bar and stack up a little blue bar for every case that radiologist 60 got right when they had correct advice, accurate advice. And I'm going to put a little red bar for every case that the radiologist got correct when they were given inaccurate advice. So if I pick radiologist 130 here, they got all 6 of their cases where they were presented accurate advice correct, and they got the last 2 cases where they were presented incorrect advice correct. Very, very few of the IMEM doctors had this, very, very few. But in general, these radiologists have better diagnostic accuracy, right? So half of them get 7 out of 8 cases correct. That's significantly fewer for the IMEM doctors. But let's look at the places where it's all blue. That means I only got it right when I was given correct advice. There are quite a few doctors that only get it right when they anchor to incorrect advice. And this is regardless of whether we say it's from an AI or a human. This is a huge challenge for an actual deployment because all models will be wrong sometimes. They just will. And we don't want to present advice in a way that people incorrectly anchor to that advice and get something wrong. And in this case, we were making, you know, like a best faith effort. We had a model that was right, you know, most of the time, and it was a plausible alternative diagnosis. What if we do something different? What if we intentionally generate biased recommendations. So I volunteered during college, actually at the end of college, for a mental health crisis line. These are pretty common. You can volunteer for them now too. There's a big overload in the mental health system, where you get a call summary where somebody has called into some crisis line. And you as a volunteer who have had a little bit of training get to make a simple decision. Given a transcript like this about a person who, potentially needs assistance, you need to make a simple triage. Should they get emergency medical help or police help? The only difference, there's no liability risk here because they're going to get help from a qualified source no matter what. But the training that you get often for these calls, for these call systems, these crisis lines, is you're supposed to call the police if there's a risk of violence. It's the only reason you would call the police over for medical help. Okay, so we gave similar training to a bunch of clinical and non-clinical volunteers. We gave them these transcripts and we only changed one thing. Whether we said the person was African American or Caucasian and then Muslim or Christian. Okay, and we asked, do you think that these people should get medical help or police help? The good news, I'll tell you now, is that when you don't give people any advice, if you just give them this, regardless of their stated attitudes towards policing, their stated political beliefs, their gender, their occupation, their age, all the different demographics we could look at, they don't more often call the police on Black or Muslim patients that are in these call summaries. That's great. Now, what happens when we give them some bad advice? And we know it's bad because we made it bad. It's actually really easy to train evil, biased models. So this is a language model that I talked about previously, right? These GPT models. And we took a biased one and we made it so that it would basically always recommend that you should call the police on Black and Muslim patients. And then we also trained an unbiased one as a control, right? So we have some people who got no advice and they did fine. They were good people and they didn't call the police more often on Black or Muslim people. And now we're going to try to give advice to some respondents. And we're going to give them some biased advice and we're going to give them some unbiased advice. Okay, so we have a good model and we have an evil model. We're going to let both models give advice to people. This passed IRB and human subjects approval, I promise. We gave this advice in two ways. I want to stress how small the difference is here. Okay, in one setting, we told people, in this situation, our model thinks you should call for police help. Or if it was a person where it wasn't giving that recommendation, in this situation, our model thinks you should call for medical help. So we gave an explicit recommendation. In the descriptive setting, so it's prescriptive, we're telling you what we think you should do, the model thinks you should do. In the descriptive recommendation, we just said our AI system has flagged this call for risk of violence, which is the predicate that we told you means you should call the police on this mental health transcript. These are tiny differences in how it's the same data, it's the same model, it's the same thing. I, as a machine learning professional, I'm a professor at MIT, I work with people to deploy models, do not often think about the tiny difference in wording. When you deploy this model, make sure you phrase it exactly. I've never thought about this before. And then we give them the same call transcripts with the race and religion flips. And we ask them to make the same decision. So now they're getting biased or unbiased advice, and they're getting it prescriptively or descriptively. So we find that both clinicians and non-experts maintain the original fair decision-making, even when you give them these really biased descriptive flags. But when you give them biased prescriptive recommendations, they follow it. What that means is if I have an evil AI that for whatever reason is always going to recommend that you call the police on Black and Muslim people, And I give you that bad advice descriptively, where I've said, hey, if there's any risk of violence, you should call the police. And then the model always says, our AI system has flagged this call for risk of violence. People don't listen to it. Both clinicians and non-experts don't call the police disproportionately more when we give the advice, the bad advice in that way. But when we give the advice in this way, people listen to it. And that's truly terrifying because this is the smallest difference. And the reason I highlight this is because there's an entire pipeline that goes into making a machine learning model where I do problem selection, data collection, outcome definition, algorithmic development, and post-deployment considerations. And at each of these steps in the ongoing process, there is a horrible opportunity or amazing opportunity to make a good or bad choice. I could select problems that only affect certain subgroups, never figure out how, how drugs affect women or minorities, not that that's been a historical issue. I could only collect data from certain subgroups where it's convenient. I could define my outcome based on implicit understandings that would exclude certain groups. I could develop an algorithm that always regresses to the mean. And therefore, if there's a minority group, it's going to delete essentially their data. And I could deploy a model in such a way that when it's wrong, it really negatively affects some people. And so my big advice for the people who are in this space, and as I said at the very beginning of this talk, I am in this space for the long run. I believe that AI can be very, very positive, a huge force for good in health. But I think we need to consider sources of bias in the data, try to correct it when possible. And if not, just acknowledge that it's there. We need to do more comprehensive evaluations. This is incredibly important. It's not done enough, in my opinion, now. The FDA doesn't require that when it clears an algorithm, you report the algorithm's performance by subgroup, just that aggregate number. So it could be misdiagnosing basically all of the Black women, and we would just never know. And really understanding the gaps that can be corrected and can't be corrected. If a model is performing differentially across two groups at 90% here, 80% here, but the human equivalent triage is at 60%. That's a clinical call, right? Like I'm not saying that you have to remove every single gap that ever exists right now in order for something to be useful, but it's something that needs to be acknowledged. And, in general, machine learning for health really suffers from reproducibility issues because people don't release their data sets. Data sets are kept private. A lot of times hospitals want to keep it so that they can de-identify it and sell it to Amazon, Google, Microsoft for research. But it's very hard for researchers to get access to large public data sets. The ones that I've cited in this paper specifically mimic are some of the very few that the machine learning community uses because there's a very aggressive reproducibility standard. And so if you're not willing to give access to de-identified data to researchers for reproducibility, often a professor like me has to opt out of using the data. And finally, I think if you remember what we said for explanations, that's not a good fix. It sounds great because it's a simple, clean solution, but it's not actually. We need to understand processes. And there are some efforts to do things like data sheets for data sets, model cards for model reporting, more generally these big picture tools that understand potential biases and work towards a more transparent, reproducible process. This is work done by a fantastic group of students that I have and both collaborators and funding sources that have been very supportive. I hope I've convinced you that we need to be very careful about how we create actionable insights in human health. Thank you.
Marzyeh, thank you very much for that very, very interesting talk. We've got a lot to think about. We've got a few questions lined up for you to address. I'd like to start by turning it over to the panel for any top line questions they may have, and then we'll get into the Q&A. And so folks on the call, if you'd like to go to the Q&A, enter your questions, vote up the ones you find most interesting, and we'll get through them in a second. Panelists?
So I'd like to start off with a question. So what's the benefit and risks of training models for independent groups of people, like just for females, just for blacks, or just for white, Caucasians, et cetera? So how do you, what there? I'm sure you'll get more accurate results potentially,
Right.
but
Yeah.
on the other hand, you may miss things as well. So what have there been studies?
Yeah, so there have been a couple of studies on this. So we have a preprint that's out on fair use of demographic information. And there's two big risks. The first is you can play that game until there's 0 people in your bucket, right? So I am the only, French, Norwegian, Iranian I know in all of Massachusetts, right? So what are my risks for diabetes or cardiovascular disease? Like, I don't know. It's a very difficult question. So I think that, we are doing these aggregated bins where they're groups that we know historically may have had differential treatment or may have suffered from different kinds of conditions. Those are probably easier to do, but you can slice those subgroups down into bins that just don't make sense anymore. And so that's one huge disadvantage. Where do you draw the line? What is a subgroup? How do I do that? The other one is related to that. As you slice, your support goes to 0, meaning that the number of data points you have to draw on to validate that your model is actually performing well for that group gets too tiny. And machine learning models really do require a larger number of data points to verify robustness.
I have a question. Thank you for the excellent talk. It's very enjoyable and informative. Don't you think that there will always be tension when we're using machine learning models, because people like the convenience and the advantages of a statistical approach of sorts, but we also like the advantages of kind of understanding the rules. For instance, my air conditioning, I know that if the ambient temperature goes above a certain threshold, my air conditioning turns on. If that doesn't happen, maybe something's broken, I can check it easily, it can be fixed easily, explain it to others. So we kind of want the best of both worlds. And the question is, will we ever get that?
I see what you're saying. So my opinion on this is that we use many things, especially in medicine, that we just don't understand. We don't understand the mechanism for Tylenol. Like, we don't understand the mechanism for many things about the human body and for human health. Also, most of the clinicians I work with, and these are smart people at Harvard, these are not dummies. They don't know exactly how the, serum potassium is calculated. Maybe it was covered at some point in some lecture years ago. It's not there. They don't know how the MRI machine works, right? Like, we use a lot of tools to inform our decisions, I think, especially in medicine, where we use a lot of treatments that we just don't really 100% understand. And I think that's okay, as long as there are other things we can provide. So instead of explaining, which is too convenient and people anchor too much to, this is just a human problem. Humans like simple explanations. And so when you give it to them, they over anchor to it. Instead of giving a simple explanation, I'm a big fan of saying, here is where you are in the calibration curve, right? So here's the recommendation, and maybe here's how many data points were close by when I made this prediction, so that you can have a good sense of how well calibrated this is in your population, or even something like models that can show exemplars, right? I am making this prediction based on this nearest neighbor from my data set, right?
But not many people can speak in higher dimensional space, very high dimensional spaces.
I'm so worried about people following advice, so worried because of these studies. So I would err on the side of saying, okay, treat it as a black box, trust it when it makes sense. When it doesn't make sense to you, question your thinking. But I'm very much on the side of not explaining because of these user studies. All of the machine learning studies I do, I feel like I sort of know the answer. Like, I expect that this is what will happen. I have a good sense of it. And all of the human studies, I'm shocked by. They're truly, truly surprising.
Thank you.
So that's really interesting. If you look at the model that's being used, can you give the person who's getting a prediction from this model some sense of accuracy or assurance that the recommendation coming from the model is applicable, or how applicable is it to this particular person based on the subgroup they're in? And so you're giving the person an opportunity to maybe have some trust with the model, or to understand how much trust they could have with the model. But another question is, it goes back to your descriptive prescriptive, which I found fascinating. Can the model vary the advice it gives to the human from more prescriptive to more descriptive based on the quality or the assurance that the model thinks is there? And by doing that, by moving it more to descriptive, you're leaving the final bit of advice up to the human that's reading this to the patient. Is that a possible way of going?
Yeah, I think that that's totally a possibility. There's always a, it really depends on the clinical setting too, I think. So I've heard really different things from each clinical collaborator on what they would want to know about model certainty. And it depends on the setting, right? For cardiology or for obstetrics or for ICU prediction, right? Like there's different aims, I think. And so depending on the label that you want and the kind of advice you want to get, I do think that this is a possibility. I think it just varies, and it needs to be, unfortunately, there's no global thing I can think of that would work really well for, these are just really different fields, right? Like you need different kinds of systems and you need advice delivered in different ways for each of these different application areas. And so I think like engaging with clinical collaborators and really understanding what they actually need for that application is probably the way it has to go.
Thank you. If there's no other questions from the panelists, let's go to the Q&A board. And so this one is the top one that's currently voted is, do self-reported race predictions by AI differ by gender? And does performance vary across categories of self-reported race?
So in our samples, which is true for most North American EHR data sets, we don't have enough data on most subgroups except for Black and white to actually feel comfortable reporting them. So you'll see in most of my papers when I do subgroup performance callouts, most of the time, unless we explicitly need it, we only look at white and Black self-reported race, because otherwise it's a very, very small group, especially in the Boston area where we don't actually have large minority communities. So in this paper, those are the two populations that we focus on because that's what we have the sample sizes for. By gender, there was not a statistically significant difference. I also want to emphasize, because it's self-reported race, we have no way of verifying that this is actually, like a self-reported race is something that people choose to put on an EHR form, right? And so for me, what race am I supposed to self-report? It was very different in Canada and the United Kingdom than it is in the United States. And so this is primarily a reflection of, somebody's sort of social construct of where they identify within society, right? And I will tell you the upshot of that paper, what we think is actually happening is that based on some other social science research, people self-report their ethnicity as Black or white, more or less is correlated with the melanin level of your skin, so your skin tone. And we think that the AI is just picking up on differences in the reflective spectrum, the refractive spectrum, of these medical imaging devices, because melanin blocks a tiny bit different proportional amount of the X-ray or spectral energy that is coming through in these medical imaging devices. So it's not like we're saying there's something fundamentally different about Black and white people, right? Like, you know, there's no genetic ancestry information in here. What we're saying is that this is and we can't prove it because we don't have like photos of people's skin in the EHR. So it's not like a provable thing. It's our assumption. There are things that an AI will be really good at detecting that we'll just be baffled by, like, what's going on here? And we need to be able to anticipate that those will happen and have good answers for how to do audits and remove things that are undesirable.
Great, kind of leads into this next question. Humans are not perfect. How do we think about the standard we expect from AI?
That's a hard question. I think a lot of what I am doing now, or that my group is thinking about now, is that question. The problem is when you get millions of examples from a hospital of the past 10 years of clinical practice, you actually don't want to follow a lot of them. You probably want to make sure that you only follow examples that follow current practice or current standard of care, and that changes for lots of reasons. You also probably want to make sure that you're not following examples when people are underperforming. And so, you know, ideally, if you ask me, how would we make sure that AI does better than humans on average, you would have to annotate which parts of care, like actual care as received in practice in real hospitals, are desirable to learn from. And we do that in other settings, right? So for self-driving cars, they don't learn on examples with crashes. Or for chess games, they're learning when people lose, right? So they're trying to mimic the people who win. There's a label. This was good care. These people won. And we don't have the same kind of thing. We use really gross proxies, like, did they die in the hospital? And that's probably not what we need. And so I think if we want to have AI maybe up to a good human standard, not just like average performance standard, we need to be intelligent about how we give those kinds of quality labels.
Really interesting. There's a lot more to talk about here. We got time for one more question, though. And here's one. Is this kind of bias in models a fundamentally unsolvable problem without more data? Is there, or could there be envisioned a paradigm of ML which would generalize in a less dangerous way?
It's a very good question. It's a fundamental tension, right? Because the problem is AI is learning to replicate society as it is. And maybe that's not what we want it to be or what we desire for the future, right? And so I think that if there are ways to do this technically, right? Like technically you can say, there are certain rules that I want to follow, or there are certain associations that I want to hand specify. The power of AI is you don't have to do that, because any person in any country, regardless of their language, education level, and biases, I think mostly, can label a dog as a dog. Mm-hmm. You can get a million examples of a million images in hundreds of places where a dog is well labeled, and we're not worried about that label implying, you know, bad things about future predictions of dogs. And that's not true for health. We're using the care that we have now and have had in the recent past and saying, let's do that forever. And then we're looking at what the machine learning models are doing and saying, oh, we don't want to do that forever. And so I think there are paradigms where you combine explicit guidelines in learning, or machine unlearning is a new term, where maybe you learn everything initially and then you try to unlearn some very specific things. There are paradigms that people are exploring. It's incredibly difficult, because if I asked you to go back through 5 years, 1 year even of a hospital EHR and mark every single time, ooh, don't learn that. That was bad practice. Could you? It's really hard. It's a challenging problem.
So we have the problem of the past data, and maybe we'll learn from this and figure out better how to code data going forward so that the machines can be gradually improved. We'll see. Marzyeh, thank you very much for very interesting and thought-provoking talk. We look forward to working with you more in the future between the IAA and your department. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.
Thank you.